how understanding the London stat crew can help your IDP team, that and more, this week on the IDP Roundtable. The guru, John Norton, here with us this week as always, and we've got another London game this week, an early game. What do we need to know about the London stat crew?
Well, we need to know that they don't know how to give assists at all. I don't know if one of the stat crews for one of the teams traveled. It doesn't look like it because this doesn't look like anything we would see out of one of our normal stat crews. But the entire game last week, there were no Raiders players credited with a single assist, or maybe and 2 Chicago players, or vice versa. There were 2 assists awarded for the entire game. One team got 0, which I think was the Raiders, and I think Chicago was awarded with 2 assists. So, assuming that they will have the same stat crew, being they're in the same place this weekend, that's something that you're not going to get a little extra boost. You're going to get your solo tackles, and if your guys don't put up a lot of solo tackles, there's not going to be many freebies thrown in there. So it will definitely have some effect on our overall numbers. Not a huge thing, but something that you might want to note for somebody that usually gets a lot of assists. Those aren't going to happen this week.
As long as they give credit for sacks, Carolina's defensive line should be good. Matt Schauf joining us. Wonderful addition to the 2019 IDP Roundtable. Every week, follow him at SCHAUFDS, DS for Draft Sharks, where you can get all of his great IDP work. And of course, the IDP hits on Twitter. Matt, we got a lot of stuff going on with safeties. We've got some safety news in Cleveland. We've got some safety news in Arizona, and one big safety line to ignore, and one other safety who might be back in our good graces. Run down the news for us at safety.
Yeah, let's start in Arizona, because I think one of the key questions last week was who's going to replace DJ Swearinger in Arizona now that they decided to stop giving freebies to tight ends every week. So was it going to be Deontay Thompson? Was it going to be Jalen Thompson? The good news is it was not Chris Banjo. That would have been bad news if he got in there because he's a veteran special teamer. So it wasn't him. It was both of the other Thompsons, though. Deontay Thompson had played 27 total snaps through the first 4 games. He jumped way up last week to a 64% share, splitting between free and strong safety. Jalen Thompson, who is also a rookie, had not played at all through 4 weeks. He played 67% against the Bengals last week. Almost all of his stuff came at free safety. Spent a little time in the box, 2 snaps at cornerback, all those specific snaps according to Pro Football Focus. So I didn't read this until today, but just before that game, coordinator Vance Joseph said he had packages for both players designed. So it was a plan to have both Jalen and Deontay involved. I wonder if it's going to look different, though, this week, because we also had slot corner Tremaine Brock leave that game with a back injury. He entered the game questionable. Budda Baker played a lot more at slot corner in that game than he has in previous games this season. He was actually back to his kind of positional playing time breakdown that he had through most of last year. So we got Budda Baker in the role, sometimes safety, most times slot corner last week. Before that last week, he was mostly a free safety, played a little slot corner. So we'll have to watch Tremaine Brock's injury this week for the roles there. If Brock is back, I don't know what to expect playing time-wise between the Thompsons. I guess that we should expect to see both of them again, and the uncertainty would probably make them both unusable. At the same time, they all have a positive matchup against Atlanta, very positive matchup against Atlanta. So it might be worth taking a shot, certainly in leagues of a certain size. But, it's a situation to watch up until the weekend so we know what's going on. In Cleveland, Morgan Burnett returned from a quad injury that cost him the previous 2 games. He was in Monday night's game against the Niners, but he only played 34% of the snaps. So obviously not starter level play. And Jermaine Whitehead stayed in the lineup. He had been filling in for Morgan Burnett, and it was still Whitehead through the full game against the Niners. So I don't know if maybe Burnett wasn't fully ready and they were easing him back in a little bit. I haven't read anything. I looked around. I've not seen coaches say anything about why he only played that little bit, or if it's a change, if they just like what they saw from Jermaine Whitehead in Morgan Burnett's absence. We'll have to see. I'm certainly not using Morgan Burnett for now. I'm hoping I get some signal on whether we can go ahead and use Jermaine Whitehead against Seattle and beyond. So we'll see on that one. The big line in Houston from Jaleel Adai, he led the Texans with 10 tackles against the Falcons last week. So you might think, oh, maybe he's playing more. Maybe we'll be able to use him going forward. Jaleel Addae played 47% of the snaps in that game. The only message from his performance is that you play defensive backs against the Falcons. Like I said, with the Cardinals safeties, even if we're not sure, maybe we go ahead and consider both Jalen and Deontay Thompson in that game, because Atlanta is the most pass-heavy offense in the league. They're supplying a lot of tackles to opponent defensive backs. Rashad Jones, on the other hand, just before the bye, we didn't see any Dolphins last week, thankfully, but just before the bye, he went back to playing full-time. Jones missed the first 4 games of the season with an ankle injury, but once the ankle was ready, he was right back to full-time, played 66 of 67 snaps against the Chargers in that game, led the Dolphins with both total tackles 9, solo tackles 6, also broke up a pass against the Chargers. So it looks like we've got the old Rashad Jones, at least in terms of role, and we should be able to use him in IDP lineups going forward. And then if John doesn't have it, I added a note about the Falcons safeties. John, is that something you're planning to talk about?
It was something I had noted, but go right ahead. You're
All right, well, thank you. So just a quick note. The Falcons placed Jonathan Cyprien on IR this week. He played about a third of the snaps last week, right after arriving via trade, but he's gone now. Kamal Ishmael played 2/3, same way he did the game before. It looks like he'll be the lead strong safety going forward. We're still going to have to watch. I think in general, if Kamal Ishmael is just in the 60 to 70% playing time range, he's not going to be somebody we want to use. But I think because they're playing against Arizona this week, which has been a terrific matchup for tackle totals for everybody in the second level of a defense, second and third level, you go ahead and take a shot on Ishmael there, and we'll see what his playing time looks like going forward.
John, the NFL is a war of attrition. Fantasy football is a war of attrition. We've got a lot of significant injuries this week I'm going to ask you to run down, because it's not just about the players that are hurt, although that can help us when we're setting things on the offensive side of our lineups. It's about the replacement players. So run down these significant injuries around the league for us.
Yeah, there's some opportunities here, but I want to chime in a little bit on the Cleveland safety situation before we move on. And I think Burnett, I believe, is going to end up back in that pretty much full-time role at some point. I think they were easing him back in with the quad injury. But also noteworthy is that Whitehead played 100% in the game that Burnett got hurt. He was not coming off the field even before Burnett's injury. Cleveland is basically running a big nickel base defense with all 3 of their safeties on the field 85-90% of the time. So at worst, one of these guys is going to wind up with an 85% game as far as playing time goes. And what I really like about Whitehead is they're pushing him up into that linebacker level, that extra linebacker depth. So I think that's where a lot of his good tackle production is coming. I wouldn't hesitate. Maybe not this week. I wouldn't necessarily start Burnett because I'm not 100% sure that he's healthy, but I think that eventually he'll be back in there, and all 3 of those guys will be worthy of starters on most weeks. Some injuries we've got to look at. There's a lot of significant ones this week. Zadarius Smith was in and out of their game with a knee injury. Had to stop play several times to help him get back off the field and so forth. He keeps coming back in, but that knee injury is eventually going to have enough wear and tear when it's going to start affecting his play. So far, he's still putting up good numbers. Definitely something you want to keep an eye on going forward. Anthony Hitchens played, I think, 11 snaps before leaving with a groin injury. Ben Neiman took over for him, had a pretty good night, put up decent tackle totals. Hitchens is not practicing as of Wednesday. If he doesn't get some practice time before the end of the week, it looks like Neiman will wind up getting the start. That's somebody that we may look at adding as a possible bye week fill-in for a couple weeks until Hitchens gets healthy. Akeem Hicks went into the game questionable with the knee, left early in the game with an elbow. Fortunately, Chicago has a bye this week, so that could be enough for him to get rested up and be able to play. But if he's one of your guys, know that he is banged up pretty good. May not be 100% even if he does play in Week 7. Chris Jones left the game with a groin injury, replaced by Derek Nottie. Nottie's looked pretty good the last couple of weeks. He's definitely not the same talent as Chris Jones is, but he has put up some pretty good numbers. So managers out there in tackle required leagues, Nottie might be somebody that you can pick up for some help for the next few weeks. Darnell Savage left with a high ankle sprain. This isn't really going to help a whole lot anybody for as far as fantasy numbers go. The Packers will probably slide Tramon Williams over to free safety and be a little more playing time for some of their younger corners that they've been filtering through a little bit. don't necessarily expect Williams' numbers to jump up all that much. He's been a good fill-in for them on the field, but it hasn't turned into box score production. Tony Jefferson on IR this week after a knee injury. Chuck Clark's likely to be the next man up there. But I think this situation, I don't know that Clark's necessarily going to put up the numbers, but we might see a little more of Josh Bynes, who took over at the linebacker spot this week. He played 78, I believe, something like that, percent of the snaps. He might actually get a little more playing time there with that situation without having, because Clark was working as their third safety coming in some passing situations. Ronnie Harrison left early with a neck injury. His replacement was Andrew Wingard. Don't know how serious that is. They showed him on the sideline trying to work it out. It wasn't like they hauled him off on a stretcher or anything. So that's just something to keep an eye on this week. Mark Barron with a hamstring. Barron was playing very well, had lockdown pretty much in every snap job. With Vince Williams coming back this week, Williams was getting very little playing time at the expense of Barron early in the game. I think Barron was maybe out a couple of snaps in the first quarter and a half before the injury. So he wasn't missing much significant time, but now he had MRI pending results. Have not heard anything on that yet as to the severity, but he is definitely hampered this week if he does play, and very well might sit out. Vince Williams is somebody that you're probably going to be able to pick up. Most of the list leagues he's going to be available, and if Barron doesn't play, he's going to be the one that benefits the most and gets the more of the playing time. Not all the injury news is bad. Darius Leonard will be back in week 7. He started practicing this week. Indy's on a bye. Looks like he'll be back in action when they come back. Alec Ogletree returned to practice this week. Practicing in full, should be good to go for week 6. CJ Mosley has been practicing a little bit, not really, very limited basis, but he has been seen out on the practice field doing a little bit of running and so forth. They're looking at possibly getting him back in action on week 7.
And for Audible, loyal superfan Brian Sumner, it's great to see you in the chat room, Brian. He says CJ Mosley still out, killing me. Maybe not next week. Matt, his former team, Baltimore, as a Steelers fan, much to my chagrin, I see Josh Bynes out there, and there's Jalen Samuels throwing a pass directly to him. I might have been able to intercept that pass. We've got some linebacker notes led with Baltimore, also some stuff on Denver and Arizona. My brain's back in Bruce Arians, Arizona. Tampa. Linebacker notes from Matt Schauf.
Yeah, I think Kevin Minter had a stint in Arizona too.
Yeah.
Really throwing you off. Yeah, I mean, Josh Bynes, they signed him last Wednesday, and then in that game against Pittsburgh, he played 72% of the snaps. So clearly they were not pleased with what they were getting next to Patrick Onwuaser in the middle of the defense. Kenny Young was a healthy scratch for the game. Chris Board was active, but he played one defensive snap. He was active for special teams. So, I mean, if Josh Bynes even just stays around 70 to 75%, he could be a good enough tackle guy to get into moderately deep leagues. He's produced tackles for us in the past. He has made coverage plays even when running backs aren't throwing the passes. So he can be valuable. Patrick Onwuaser has been a little bit disappointing for as far as I'm concerned in his tackle collection so far. He's been fine, though. I still think he has upside that has yet to be tapped in pass rushing and in coverage himself. But keep an eye on Josh Bynes as a possibility. In Denver, of course, Josie Jewell has been out with a hamstring injury that he had at first. Then he tried to come back and left that game early. He was out completely this past week. Alexander Johnson played in his place, played 93% of the snaps in that game, and he racked up 9 tackles, 6 solos, 1 tackle for loss, an interception, plus a second pass defense. So unless Alexander Johnson pushes Josie Jewell aside, unless he plays well enough to do that, I think his playing time bodes well for Josie Jewell's role. If we haven't seen a healthy Josie Jewell game since Todd Davis returned to the lineup. So we're still kind of not sure what the two roles there look like, but I would say Alexander Johnson's playing time helps Jewell, unless Johnson's playing well enough to, just take snaps away from Jewell himself. And then finally, Kevin Minter, I mentioned. Devin White was back active last week, and so that seemed to mean that it was time for him to step back into the lineup and Kevin Minter to leave the field. But instead, Devin White played nary a snap for the Buccaneers against the Saints. Kevin Minter played all of the snaps in the middle, and Bruce Arians told us afterward at his Monday press conference that Devin White was activated only as an emergency guy. He said they were down to 3 inside linebackers because Jack Sitchie was hurt. So Devin White was there if they absolutely needed him. Apparently, they didn't absolutely need him because I guess Kevin Minter didn't get hurt. They were hurting pretty bad overall. But Arians did say that Devin White will be ready for the Panthers this week. So we should assume this time around that their top draft pick is going to step back into the lineup and push Kevin Minter back into obscurity. If you're looking to use one of them, I would play Devin White this week against the Panthers.
And some of our top draft pick in our IDP Dynasty rookie drafts, if you got Devin Bush instead of Devin White, you're probably feeling pretty good about that. I think Bush was going ahead of White in some of my leagues. Got some more linebacker notes, John, around the league. Avoid the Chargers as usual. One of our darlings, Quincy Williams, maybe losing his shine. Give us some updates on linebackers around the league.
Well, first of all, I completely agree with pretty much everything Matt said there. You know, Josh Bynes, he's one of those guys that wherever he goes, he seems to put up good tackle numbers when he's on the field. As long as he gets 70-80% of the playing time, I think he'll be fine as a bye-week fill-in or matchup-based starter for us. A.J. Johnson looked pretty darn good to me just watching that game. The defense entirely looked different. They looked a lot more energized this week. He was a big part of that. I'm not so sure that Josie Jewell is a guy that we're going to be able to trust with any regularity in a full-time role anyway. I just don't think he's good enough in coverage to handle that full-time job. I was very surprised to see Johnson get a shot at a 3-down role. So, we'll see how that goes going forward. But I wouldn't be terribly surprised to see Johnson start eking some playing time out even when everybody's healthy. Tony Reeder is another guy that had a pretty big game this week in Los Angeles for the Rams. He was the only one on the team that put up more than 4 solo tackles, finishing with 8 solos and 5 assists. I'm not sure that this is anything to get too excited about. He did play a near full-time role in this game, which is something that Bryce Hager was not doing, who Reeder replaced. So maybe there's a little change up in the way they're going to approach things there. Definitely something to keep an eye on going forward. But I don't expect him to outproduce Little or even John Johnson with any regularity. But he may be something that we get deeper into the season and we get into the bye weeks, especially the later bye weeks. We're going to be scrounging a lot for guys that are going to have opportunity, and this is somebody we want to have that name stashed in our hat there. Nicholas Morrow. We've talked about him last week with the Burfict situation. He has been the guy that stepped into that role. He has 10 tackles, 2 passes defended, a pick, and less than 2 games of action. Playing pretty well on the field, passes the eyeball test. I think at this point he's probably as good a football player as Burfict was physically and so forth. And the only thing that made Burfict the starter there, I think, was his knowledge and experience in this particular defensive scheme. So I think Morrow is going to be fine going forward. Another guy that played virtually full-time, 90-some% of the snaps, going to get plenty of opportunity there. Definitely somebody that should be on our pickup list. The Atlanta linebackers, I put on my notes here, why has Devondre Campbell outscored Deion Jones in 4 out of 5 weeks? And I think watching him play a little bit, it just comes down to the fact that Jones is not 100% back from his injury from last year. He's not the same aggressive guy. He's not flying around the field like he has in the past. Campbell's playing more of a full-time role than what we've seen in the past. He's been one of those guys that's been a tease for us a lot in years past with he'll have a few games in a row where he plays a significant amount of snaps and then he'll drop down to a 60-70% for a few weeks and take his numbers with it. It doesn't look like that's going to happen this year. He's staying up there in the snap count and putting up good numbers, playing well on a defense that's not playing well. He's one of the few bright spots that they have. Quincy Williams this week was benched in the 4th quarter. If you watched that game and watched McCaffrey pretty much run through them and over them and around them as he has with everybody else, it's not hard to understand why the coaching staff wanted to try something different. The fact of the matter is they put Najee Good in his place, and he didn't fare any better. Miles Jack didn't look all that great either. So I don't know that was necessarily an indictment on the Jaguars defense or Quincy Williams so much as it was that the Panthers and McCaffrey are just playing so well at this point. What we don't know, however, is if it was going to be a temporary thing or if they were upset enough to keep him out of the lineup going forward. I would definitely keep him on my bench this week unless we get some kind of a clarification there. Chargers linebackers, avoid these guys like the plague at this point. No Chargers linebacker played more than 40 out of 61 possible snaps last week. They're splitting it way up. Everybody's getting a piece of the pie. Even Kazir White played 37 snaps or something like that. They're just rotating a lot of guys through there. They had 5 linebackers, saw at least 17 snaps. So they're not settling on anybody. Nobody's getting the lion's share of the opportunity at this point, even after Thomas Davis was so good early on. So I would avoid that situation, at least until we get some more clarity or they decide what they're going to do there. And last thing, an update on Camus Grugier-Hill. Saw an increase in snap count in his second game action, up to 20 snaps this week, at the expense of Zach Brown, as expected. And I think we are maybe a week or two, or possibly even this week, we could see Grugier-Hill in a near full-time role, if not a full-time role. At the very least, that is coming on the horizon.
Matt, I want you to have the you have the unenviable task, Matt, of giving people a reason to watch a little bit of the Washington-Miami game. Because certainly when we look at these defenses, the Washington defense is a better defense than the Miami defense, and probably a better defense to find IDP plays this week. Give us some potential diamonds in the rough, or some diamonds in the dumpster fire in Washington playing Miami this week.
Sigmund, if your request is that I give people a reason to watch this game, I will do no such thing. And I will turn my computer off.
Go get your grocery shopping done. Do your laundry.
Yeah, I will, however, give people some defensive players that they can play. And let me say before we get too far away from it, the Chargers linebackers, I hope that Thomas Davis's playing time was down into the 60% range because he entered the game with an injury. I have no idea if that's the case. The Chargers linebackers are like the 49ers wide receivers of defensive playing time. So I agree with John that if you can afford it, you don't play any of them this week, and we'll see what happens. Just my fingers are crossed that was what limited Thomas Davis to that point. So we'll see. Back to Washington, which I'm obviously avoiding talking about, but the matchup with Miami has been, tremendous for everybody who plays against them this year. And the Washington defense is a starting option this week as a team defense just because of that matchup. But since we're not interested in team defenses here, let's talk about some of the individuals. And Cole Holcomb, I think we're on weekly Cole Holcomb updates at this point. His playing time is up in week 5, 78% in that one. That was his largest snap share since back in week 2 when the rookie played 90%. In between, he played 48%, 55%. So it's not a trend yet. We don't know what's going on with his playing time yet. But Cole Holcomb has put up numbers. He has outproduced John Bostic in tackles, I believe, 3 out of 5 games so far. I don't have the numbers in front of me at the moment, but at least 3 out of 5 games, despite John Bostic playing more snaps. So John Bostic still played more than Cole Holcomb did in that game, but Cole Holcomb put up the numbers. He looks like the higher upside player. The matchup makes Cole Holcomb worth taking a shot on this week. If I had to choose between him and pretty much anybody on the Chargers, I'd probably go ahead and take a shot on Cole Holcomb. Maybe Thomas Davis would be the one guy I would play over him. But elsewhere on the Washington defense, Monte Nicholson, their free safety, has turned into a top 10 fantasy defensive back so far this year. He is tied for 15th among all DBs in tackles and total tackles. He has 5+ solos in 3 of his 5 games so far. 2 interceptions as well. We saw Nicholson starting last year at the beginning of the year for them, but then he lost his starting job to Clinton Dix, which still amuses my kids every time they are reminded of the name. It looks like Monte Nicholson's in there to stay this time. I'm not sure they have anybody to replace him. He's delivering numbers. This is a tremendous matchup for him, turnover upside against Miami. And then up front, we might be getting healthier in Washington. Jonathan Allen had a knee sprain earlier in the year, suffered it in week 1, missed, I believe it was 1 game now, came back for the next 3, but his playing time wavered a little bit in between, came back at about 70%, then played about 55%, was back up above 70% this past week, had a sack against the Patriots. Washington as a team had a season high 4 sacks against the Patriots, and that's not a positive sack matchup. So, we'll see whether that's a good sign for the team or just a fluky thing from the game. But This defense showed a little spark last year, so there's a chance that the defense is going to get better. Jonathan Allen, at the very least, is certainly an option against this garbage Miami team. And then finally, Matt Ioannidis I include just because I only recently learned how to say his name out loud, but he's starting to deliver numbers like he did last year. He gave us tackles through the middle of the year, started delivering sacks, and then he got hurt, and he was kind of, even when he was in the lineup, he was not really himself, so he didn't really give us much over the second half of last season. But he's putting up numbers a little bit this year. I think there's still some untapped sack potential there. I think he's a sleeper type to play this week against Miami, and then we'll see how he does for projecting beyond that.
Matt, now that I got you full screen, we might have you do a board game of the week segment too, because I think there's some board games you could bring into our life there. I know that the guru always brings some very prudent advice about New England. It used to be don't trust New England linebackers. Then we have Kyle Van Noy. It used to be don't trust the defensive linemen. Then we had last week, what's our latest way to navigate the New England defense?
Well, we're back to don't trust any of them again, I think, with the exception of Jamie Collins. So what we seem to have here with the Patriots linebacker situation is a big game of musical chairs. It depends on what they decide to use for a base defense that any given week as to who is going to put up numbers for us. Weeks 1 and 5, they opened in a 3-4 with Kyle Van Noy and Jamie Collins at the outside linebacker positions, rushing off the edge. That's a situation that Collins seems to flourish in. Collins so far has flourished whatever they've asked him to do. We've had one good week out of Kyle Van Noy. That was a week that they started in a 4-3, and Van Noy was basically a weak side linebacker for the majority of that game. They're just back and forth every week. This past week, we had Dante Hightower starting at the inside linebacker position as he did in week 1. This week he played every snap. First time he's done that this season. Put up some big numbers for us, 5 tackles, an assist. I think he had a sack. Maybe a pass defended, but you put up good points for us. So this team is so matchup oriented, and they will change their defense so often that unless you're have somebody sitting in there watching to see what kind of defense they're going to play each week, or you're a lot better at deciphering it than I am, this is probably a situation where we should avoid most of these guys on a weekly basis. Anybody that's not named Jamie Collins. That said, if you're in one of those situations later in the season where you've got 4 or 5 teams on a bye, or 4 or 6 teams on a bye, and you're hurting at the position, take a look at the matchups. These guys are capable of having a big game on any given week. Just with Van Noy, you get 1 big game and 3 stinkers so far. So there's a lot of gamble there with anybody besides Collins. I'm going to try to avoid them if I can. Their defensive ends are another situation that we probably need to avoid going forward. So far, they've had 1 defensive end play more than 30 snaps in a game over the first 5 weeks. That was John Simons, who had lion's share of the snaps a couple weeks ago and had a big game. This past week, they spread it out real thin. No defensive end played more than 19 snaps in that game.
Yeah, we finally even got our Dante Hightower game that we've been waiting for. Other notes on the defensive line, not just John Simon, who I actually did plug in a lineup or 2, I'm ashamed to say, just because I got a big goose egg. Maybe not some goose eggs coming from one of the rookies that you told us to track, and an old standby who's on bye this week, but may be worth more going forward.
Yeah, a couple of guys who looked up last week and are sitting this week, so we can't do anything with them right away. Mentioned Max Crosby last week. And he went from a stash to a pickup and use, it looks like. He went from playing 26% of the snaps in week 3 to 57% in week 4, and then played all but 1 snap in that win over the Bears in London. I mean, maybe he's just better on that side of the pond than over here, but he delivered a sack in that game. The week before that, he forced a fumble, QB hit, had 2 pass deflections. Crosby played almost all of last week's game on the right edge in place of Clellan Ferrell, who was out with a concussion. But the week before, he played just about as many snaps on the left end as he did on the right end this past week. Benson Mayowa's playing time has come way down from the beginning of the season, so that can allow room for Crosby to play. And really, Crosby's just a good athlete who was productive in college for a team that needs good athletes who are going to produce. So I think there's reason to believe that Crosby can stick in the lineup going forward. I mean, he's not a huge guy, so it might be better for him if his playing time comes back down some. Maybe it keeps him more productive. Certainly worth watching to see exactly what his role is. And I believe Arden Key is dealing with another injury now, so that only takes another guy out of the mix. And Arden Key hasn't really been producing anyway, so regardless of his health, there's room for Crosby, and I think there's reason to believe he stays in the lineup going forward. I don't know if I would start him in week 7, but stashing him in a deep league to see what happens beyond that is a good move. And then for the Colts, Jabal Sheard returned the week before and then played more against the Chiefs this past Sunday night. Played 51% of the snaps in his first game back, and that was after a summer knee operation. He wasn't even putting in full practices, still played half the game. That climbed to 71% against the Chiefs, and he had a half sack in that game. The Colts overall did a much better job of rushing Patrick Mahomes than most other opponents do. So that looks good for the Colts going forward. It looks good for Sheard going forward. I'm sure a bye week can only help him rest that knee a little further. And then after they return from the bye, I count at least 6 upside matchups among their next 8 games. They still have Houston twice. They have Denver. They have Miami. They have Tennessee. They have Tampa left on the schedule. I think all of those are good sack matchups. I think Sheard could turn into somebody that we're starting every week pretty soon.
And rising star Kamiko Toure out with an ankle. That was sad to see, but then something else, open opportunity. Matt, John Gruden in your top 3 coach of the year ballot?
I guess he has to be right now, but they're going to come back from the bye and lose 3 games in a row. So
Ooh,
forget about
bold
no, that's
talk.
not a prediction. That's not a prediction. That's more of a joke at the NFL's expense.
We were always happy with those. I know that the guru has to be happy that John Gruden's bringing back some of that old spirit of the Raiders, and always one of our IDP coaches of the year, in part because of our matchups. What do you have for us this week, John?
Yeah, I'm a Bengals fan by birth and a Raiders fan by choice.
Yeah.
All right, so guys, I want to get into my lineup this week. I very much agree with you on Max Crosby, by the way. He was another guy that I had on my short list of stuff to talk about, and a guy that I talked about in my column this week. Some defensive backs we want to try to get into our lineup this week, especially if you're in corner required leagues. I like Byron Murphy versus Atlanta. Matt touched on it a few times there about how good of a matchup they are for defensive backs in general. 5 of the 6 starting corners that have faced Atlanta over the last 3 games have recorded at least 5 solo tackles. 4 of them have at least 1 pass defended as well. Drake Kirkpatrick this week versus Baltimore. At least 1 corner has reached 5 solo stops against the Ravens in every game this season, with 3 of them reaching 7 or more. Kirkpatrick is the Bengals' leading tackler from the corner position, and the guy that's likely to be the target in this matchup to put up the better numbers. Janoris Jenkins, and maybe even rookie DeAndre Baker if you're in dire need at the corner position against New England. Opponents' corners as a position have recorded an average of 14.2 tackles per game against the Patriots. Brady's not a guy that's going to give them a lot of opportunity for big plays, but there seems to be a lot of tackles going up with this matchup. Move on to the linebackers, Devondre Campbell. We talked about him already as far as what's going on there. You would think that Arizona might not be a great matchup, but that's not necessarily the case. Over their last 3 games, 5 linebackers have reached double-digit points versus Arizona, and 4 of them have reached 15 or more. Campbell's has been the highlight for the Falcons so far, and I'd look for another good game out of him this week. Some edge rushers, pass rushers out there at the linebacker position, Matt Judon and Pernell McPhee against the Bengals. We talk about the Bengals pretty much every week. The offensive line's injury riddled. They're having a hard time blocking anybody. I think they could put 13 guys on the field and would still give up 4 or 5 sacks a week. So both of those guys are high output, high upside type guys in big play leagues. Nick Vigil and Preston Brown also in that game on the other side. The Bengals can't seem to get off the field on defense, and they can't seem to sustain much on offense. That means a lot of opportunity for these guys at linebacker. We've seen the Ravens be an excellent matchup for linebackers and pretty much anybody that puts up a lot of tackles already. Linebackers have averaged 6.8 solo tackles and 3.7 assists and added 2.5 sacks inside and weak side linebackers, that is. Defensive linemen, Robert Quinn and DeMarcus Lawrence versus the Jets. These are probably at this point guys that I shouldn't have to tell you to start pretty much every week, but especially with this matchup. the Jets might be getting their quarterback back, and a couple of guys are finally starting to get healthy. They're getting their starting tight end back and all that good stuff, but they still have the same offensive line out there that's given up 4 sacks in every game so far and gave up 10 to the Eagles last week. Taco Charlton versus Washington. Redskins have given up 12 sacks in the last 3 games. Charlton has been the one of the few bright spots for Miami. He's had a sack in each of the games that he's played since coming to the team. Played well all through the offseason, preseason with Dallas. Was kind of surprised to see them let him go anyway. But I think he could get in there and make a little bit of noise against Washington this week as well. Emmanuel Ogbah versus Houston, particularly if Okafor is still out, which it looks like he may be. He's not practicing yet this week. Houston's allowing 3.4 sacks per game, while giving it 6 in 2 games this year, twice in the last 5 games, in fact. So Okafor is a guy, Ogbah is a guy that's getting a lot of opportunity to move in as a starter. Played almost 80% of the snaps this week. He was a guy that was kind of on my watch list even before this injury because he was producing relatively well, putting up decent tackle numbers. He hasn't gotten to the quarterback in the last couple of weeks, but Houston gives up a lot of sacks, so there's a good opportunity there. Kind of already mentioned Derek Nottie versus Houston as well. So if you're in a tackle required league, that's a guy you're probably going to want to target. A couple guys I want to get out of my lineup this week. Jermaine Whitehead versus Seattle. Not so much for the matchup, but I'm not quite sold that we know exactly what's going on there in Cleveland yet. If you've got another good option, I might set him out just to make sure we get a good double check on what's going on there as far as playing time goes. Quincy Williams, don't know for sure if he's going to be a starter this week. Baltimore's inside linebackers against the Bengals. This defense is so bad. Offense is so bad. There's just not much opportunity for anybody to make tackles against them. They're just not on the field. The Bengals offense is not on the field long enough.
With Nadi and Agba and Okafor in Kansas City, it's like one of those UConn teams from the 90s.
Yeah, where's God Shamagod? That was Providence, right? You're really close to my heart here with Big East basketball. Oh, the Big East. I miss the old Big East, but I never miss a chance to spend time with Matt Schauf and the guru, John Norton. Thank you, everybody. Always love everyone showing up. The real diehards, the people playing real fantasy football, IDP fantasy football. Thank you always, folks, and thank you for supporting what we do, not just at Football Guys at Draft Sharks, but just the fantasy football industry. We have a good time, and we have a good time because you deserve the best. We want to bring you the best, and we always want to enjoy your company here. So thank you so much for being so classy.